All right, what's up, fellow tent pros, and welcome back to the Pitch and Tent podcast with your host Davis West and
Brian Bolt.
for the last time.
This is the swan song, so to
This
speak.
is it. And today we've got an awesome guest on. It's going to be probably a little bit on the terms of getting things from one place to another. And I'm going to let you introduce him because this piece of equipment that this guy works for, it's one of the biggest ones in the industry. And it's a very well-known piece of equipment that it really changes the game.
Yep. So let's talk about today's subject matter is primarily operational efficiencies in the tent rental company. So today's guest is none other than Mr. Andy Matrick. How you doing, Andy?
Very good. How are you guys?
We're great.
Awesome.
I've had the pleasure of knowing Andy for some years now. We're going to talk about Andy's very much involved in a piece of equipment that everybody's familiar with, being TentOx. So we're going to talk about TentOx, but the bigger picture today that I really want to cover are these operational efficiencies. And I think that goes all the way back to Andy's early days with a company called Event Central, owned by Mr. Scott Woodruff in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania. That was many, many years ago, wasn't it, Andy?
It was, yeah. He sold that business just around 2013, 2014. So it's been a little bit.
Yep. So give us a little background on Andy Matrick and where you started out in the tent business and how that came to be.
Sure.
Give us a little background for context.
Sure. Yeah. So sophomore in college, coming into my sophomore year, there was a opening. I believe it was Craigslist of all places. That's when Craigslist was the place to be with, looking for summertime help. I applied for a job and did not know much of anything about it and went and did an interview and only made it into the showroom, right? And sat down with Scott Woodruff, kind of just explained what I was looking for and did a tour of the warehouse. And again, just, looking at some of this stuff, looking at some of the crew that was there, I was saying, what's this all about? And eventually did a second interview, became, a helper, on the road in the warehouse, sort of doing, multiple different things throughout the day, like a lot of tent guys start out with, just cleaning and, palletizing things in and out of trucks. But I definitely gravitated towards being on the road. I didn't know anything about, putting up a tent or any of these multiple pieces and pins and ratchets or any of this stuff. So it was exciting. The fact that, pretty much unlimited overtime, I could take that money and the hours and put it towards college. That was huge. And that continued. So multiple summers of doing that, went into a dispatch role eventually just because we started to grow and kind of get outside of just the Harrisburg, PA location. And, that was exciting too. It was something different every day.
Yep.
And I really enjoyed that. Graduated with a degree in pretty much graphic design, communicative arts. And I explored that, but it was during the downturn of the economy, which was 2009, 2010, applied for a lot of jobs, pretty much between DC, Baltimore, Philly, and just wasn't getting anywhere. I did land a job eventually and I gave it a shot, and Scott came calling and basically said, hey, we're willing to open up a position for you that speaks to, sort of your degree, and we really like to keep you on board. And I wanted to stay on board. I wanted to see what else was out there, but he made me a really good offer. And I said, you know what? I know this business. I know the people. I know the owner. This is something that, is intriguing, and let's just see where it goes. So then later became general manager, and Scott kind of, came to me and the entire company and said, hey, I'm looking to get out of this. I'm going to be selling the business here eventually, and I want you to be a part of it. And that was exciting too. Talking to other business owners, taking a look at their operation, talking to people that were completely outside of the tent business that may have interest in getting into it. He sent me all over the place to talk to people and see, what their interest levels were. So he essentially then sold the business. Again, that was, 2013, 2014 time. And that then grew with the new owner, who was more Philadelphia based, over another 6 to 7 years, from 2 locations to then 4 locations.
Wow.
So again, a lot of excitement in growing in the Mid-Atlantic area, getting into some bigger jobs, getting some, different inventory. Our tent sizes were growing, our company was growing, and we were sort of busting at the seams, especially at the Harrisburg location. So it was awesome, and it was 100 miles an hour even during the slow season because
Yep.
there's, the Northeast, it still is a seasonal business, typically, April through November. But I would always joke and say, the busiest time was the planning time, during the time that, may be too cold to be setting up tents. But we stayed busy and we focused on other areas. And it definitely was, it was and still is a grind in regards to, just continuing to build and to get better. So, yeah, this year's 19 years in the tent rental industry for me.
Wow.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So one of the first times I ever met you was probably the second Mattress Spring training, I think, of all time. We got snow that day. I do remember when
Remember that?
Event Central was our host for Mattress Spring training. And the thing that blew me away more than a lot of, and I've seen to this day, I've seen probably thousands of event rental companies or had visits, thousands of visits over the years. And the degree of organization and efficiencies that were evident at Event Central that day caught my attention, right? And we see a lot of different plays. And Andy was, I want to make sure all the listeners understand, certainly that was Scott Woodruff. That was an output of his brain for sure, because if anybody knows Scott, he is very much into organization and efficiencies, which are, again, that's that's our main topic of today. But certainly Andy had a lot to do with that as well. So, Andy, as far as your early findings of trying to do things differently, my first question would be, why would you want to do things differently than everybody else? And then secondarily, how would you go about that? That's a big question, I know.
That's a lot to unpack.
It is a big question. And, I have different ways of dissecting it, again, from working it and seeing the day to day. A big topic that everybody talks about is labor and the turnover and finding good people and the awkwardness of this industry of, moving things and having to do things. You're there until the job's done. And that could be an easy day or it could be a really hard day. And anything that we could do to make it more efficient, which then obviously was good on the company from a payroll standpoint, but then from a morale standpoint of making sure that these guys came back the next day to make things easier. It required a lot of R&D, right? It required a lot of throwing things against the wall and trying things. And some people would sit there and say, here's another crazy idea, like, what's this one going to turn out to be? And, we put this time and energy into doing things. And then, you sort of feel like you're reinventing the wheel again. I'm not trying to look at it from a negative standpoint, but there are those other, views of, how we do these things. But things as simple as, Brian, if you remember our wash bay and having the automated drying racks to go up and down with drills. And later, we essentially had a button around our neck that, we were pressing that button and everything was coming up and down without having to touch anything other than putting the vinyl on the trusses. But, investing in some of that equipment to make the day-to-day easier, that was huge. And Scott was never somebody to not look at it any other way, to say, I'm going to throw some money at this to see if it works. And if it doesn't, it doesn't. We'll figure it out. But a lot of the time it did. A lot of the time he thought through those, things that we're getting held up with. It really worked out to our favor. And I think quite a few people adapted to it after they saw it, whether, again, that was the trusses or it was something as simple as, the racking in your warehouse with drive-in racks for chairs, or, some of the racks that you have in the back of your truck, even the investment of, getting a tractor trailer when everybody said, hey, maybe it's, too soon to get into something like that. And then that thing's running every single day after, having it for 6 months. So, that risk that's involved with that. And, I have to think the behind the scenes of him talking to, his partners, such as, when you go down to Matro or, ARA or ATA, whatever it is, and pitching ideas and seeing what other operations are doing. Scott was very well versed in, visiting some of the top companies, on the East Coast to see how they were benefiting from things as well, and tweaking it to make it work for our location, for our size of business. And then it's just being clear with people, right?
Yep.
What the expectation is, and saying, hey, if this works, you got to tell me, you got to give me the feedback, you,
Yep.
you got to share what's really going on, because Scott wasn't in the field every day, I wasn't
No.
in the field every day. But you see what happens when people come off a long day and then have another long day the next day. It's that vicious cycle, right? And trying to get in front of it, and trying to do whatever you can to make it an easier place to work and a better place to work.
Yep. He was always at the top of the heap and still is in terms of people that I know that are willing to learn, regardless of how many years he's got under his belt, right?
No doubt. Yeah, and that's just who he is. And a lot of the time I describe him as having the most curious mind you've ever met. He will look at something and analyze it and pick it apart and say, "That's a good thing." How can we use this here? A lot of conversations like that.
Yep. And one of the things we want to talk to today certainly is about TentOx, but let's go way back to where kind of that whole thing, at least from, and correct me if I'm wrong, but where I first saw it was in the blue articulated piece of equipment. Was that an Avant back then, right? Or not?
Oh, so very similar.
Yeah.
Very, very similar. It articulates, it pivots in the middle, the engine's in the rear, with the forks in the front, but it was essentially a Gale loader. And there's a whole story behind, Gale and Avant, and I'm not as familiar with it and where things started and the transition there between Gale. But Scott purchased that, and where our current tools are, here's your stake driver, you detach that, and then you put on your stake puller, then you put on your roof panel puller, then you put on your plate, all these separate tools. Scott essentially built with a steel worker, with a welder, a tool that went on the front of that machine that was both a stake driver and a stake puller. So it's very large, very clunky.
Wow.
I mean, you could hear this thing coming from a mile away. And it worked, right? Every 60 wide pole tent, that thing was out there. It was small, so the material handling aspect of it was a little, lifting up to 60 wide, 60 by 30, mids or ends. That wasn't easy. Didn't have counterweights on it. It was more a glorified stake driver and stake puller.
Yeah,
Sure.
but I think the bigger point there is the fact that it was one of the early things that I ever saw in the industry, one of the early attempts at taking some of the heat off of the guys day to day, right? And looking for efficiencies in the operation.
And that's the name of the game, too, for somebody that's been in the field as well. I mean, those 90-hour work weeks, you get beat down by Thursday. And if you have something that's in your arsenal like that can take that sledgehammer out of your arms,
Yep.
It's huge.
Yep.
Yeah, we used to fight over it every single day. Who's getting the machine?
We've heard multiple stories since now that people are hiring drivers just for their TentOx, and so they don't. So there's no
so
fight.
The crew doesn't fight all day.
Take that off the table.
Yeah. No.
One of our good friends and customers, Dan Hooks, re-quote this all the time. He told me years ago. He said, at the end of the day, we're pretty much a labor and movement company. We talk about doing events, and we put on events. We do incredible things and have just unbelievable events. But at the end of the day, we're using people and moving stuff around. Mm-hmm. So again, that's why the impetus for today's content was, let's talk about why it's so important to be able to move things around. Right.
Yeah. So again, talking a little bit about the Gale loader and seeing, I can use this for driving stakes and pulling stakes, but sort of the how of the Swiss Army knife. And that's how Scott marketed it. I remember using Mongo movers, two-wheel dollies. You have all these separate tools, right, that all need separate service, and they take up space, whether it's in the truck or, back at your shop. How can we combine these needs for the everyday company into sort of one package? And that's where the idea started. Obviously, pairing it up with a machine that Scott felt would be great for our industry. And, when Dan talks about logistics and moving, your next concern is, what about the customer that I'm servicing? What about preserving their ground and their space that they put a lot of money and energy into, turf fields like at a college campus or a golf course. You can go on forever. But, pairing it up with that, I know we'll go into safety eventually, but moving everything. And I go back to the story of, morale of when that 26-foot box truck gets on site and you open up that back door and you're just looking at that thing crammed to the gills. You're saying, how are we
God.
going to get this done before
Yeah.
the sun goes down? You know what I mean? And then they're changing things and, they're adding things and this needs moved here. The whole thought process, and this is what I talk to a lot of customers about, is while you are measuring, squaring off that pole tent, or you are, talking to the customer, that machine is going back and forth to the job site with everything that you need, right? It's driving the stakes, the things that the machine can do while you're there doing the things that your hands and brain need to do, putting a price tag on that. We would sit there at Event Central and look at how many times the guys were coming back and forth from the truck.
Mhm.
And that truck could be, 400 yards away, and there's a guy going back for one R pin, one 1-inch ratchet. Looking at how you put those things in bins and you move them all to that job site so that you can be more efficient. That again is, a huge part of, what the thought process was behind TentOx.
Awesome. Would you agree then that moving things around is probably the biggest problem that tent rental companies face? Just moving things around.
Yeah, yeah, and again, the thought process of looking at the machine as a stake driver and stake puller is great, but once you start with that machine, and then you start to move some of your inventory on how it's warehoused around the machine.
Mm.
We used to loose load everything in that truck. We would go up on a man lift and pull one top at a time
Mhm.
and put it on a dolly and throw it in the back of the truck.
Mhm.
You know, Over about 3 to 4 months of having that machine, we were palletizing everything. We were putting everything in carts, everything in bins so that that truck could be offloaded in a matter of 30 minutes of people just bring it to the back so that
Yep.
the machine could pick it up and move it where it needed to go. Again, it was a huge development with everybody on our team to say, well, what if we did it this way?
And now the machine can take it from the back of the truck and literally take it to the other side of the job, other side of the job site before the next item could even be handled.
Yep. Yeah. And I know that a lot of people look at the price tag. They look at what's going on there. It's almost seeing is believing. We've had a lot of good scenarios where people do have relationships with what they call quote unquote their competitor, the neighboring one that gets into one, and they see what's going on there. We try and educate the customer in regards to talking to them about how this is going to help with timing on the job site as well. Get us in and out of there quicker, make things easier for everybody, not only just the tent company, but the customer as well. So again, there's a level of professionalism that comes with it as well.
Yep. I remember talking to Scott post COVID, and everybody got so labor sensitive, obviously during the COVID days, because labor was already tough to come by. Then it got pretty much impossible because people were truly just
They got to sit
they
at
were
home.
they were literally getting paid in a lot of cases to stay at home. And so now, and I told Scott, I said, okay, now, because I started seeing how many of those machines were being sold to people that if you had asked me a year prior, I would have told you, I don't know if they're ready for a machine. Now that these people are feeling like they can't not have one, right? They have to, because now it's truly taking the place of people, which is what Scott's early vision was to begin with, right? Is to be efficient, just as we're talking about.
Yeah, the word automation, right? We're always going to need people, right?
Mm-hmm.
But for the strenuous tasks that we're doing on a day to day, and again, getting those people to come back the next day,
Mhm.
and the safety aspect of the machine's doing the heaviest lifting, so that you're not breaking your back and tearing some muscles and sore the next day. That's what keeps people going. So,
Oh, yeah.
yeah.
And I mean, in a world
Yeah.
full of concrete ballast now too, it's a
Oh my
game
gosh.
changer as well.
Yep.
I mean,
Yeah, and I'm happy to speak on that too. I mean, we're in a very Harrisburg, PA is that sort of corporate corridor
Mhm.
between some major cities. So you have a lot of big businesses and warehouses. If I had to throw a number at it, I'd say 60% of the tenting that we did had ballast on it.
Right.
So, talk about that tractor trailer, stake bodies, and anything from block and roll to, Lego blocks that are 2,500 pounds. We did have a piggyback initially to move those, and then, graduated into a larger TentOx with a 700 series because we were maxing out the 500 all the time. But, and I think I've told this story before, we were planning our days around the use of the machine. So, if we had a day that, the customer thought we were coming on Thursday, but we had some free time Wednesday afternoon to drop those ballasts at their site Wednesday afternoon so that we send the crews over there Thursday morning and the ballasts are already there and they're already placed and ready to go. I mean, you're shaving off a lot of time just doing that.
You're shaving off hours just doing that.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's huge.
And it's all exponential when you start putting dollar signs to it.
Yes. When you do that over and over again.
Yeah. And I think that's a lot of what Dan's talking about with the logistics, right? The amount of money that you can save by, getting ahead of the 8 ball there, that's huge from a logistics standpoint.
It's the universal language everybody speaks, money. And at the end of the day, it's the bottom line that counts. I want to touch too, if we can, let's kind of pivot just a little bit in terms of warehousing, because again, back to those early days when I first laid eyes on Event Central and then became a lot more in tune to what people then started doing. I think there was a shift back during that time in terms of what we would see with event rental companies and how much focus people started putting on warehousing, logistics, and again, the ability to handle the material. And again, equipment notwithstanding, but literally how you structure your warehouse, how you lay it out. Again, back to Scott's getting a heck of a commercial about Event Central here, by the way, but but even that, I remember seeing a rack for linens from a dry cleaning store that started on the ground, took up very minimal space, but went up over top onto dead space over the offices. Right, Andy? Do I remember that correctly?
We called it the roller coaster.
Yeah. Yep. So it took up very minimal space down on the floor, right? Used otherwise space above the offices that wouldn't have been used otherwise. Just walk us through some of those ideas.
Yep. So, we were the one-stop shop, right? We tried to be. So we did have a lot of soft goods. We worked with a lot of caterers. So everything you're describing with the linens, the dishes, things that could break pretty easily, things that could get ripped and torn up. We separated that from our tenting side. So that was in the front of the house while all of our tenting was in the back of the house. But we also recognized that real estate in that warehouse was number one priority. We were 30-foot ceilings, but we were to the top of those ceilings from front to back. Yep. We had maxed out probably the last 4 years that we were there. There wasn't an inch left in that warehouse that hadn't been discussed about potentially changing or doing something different to create more space. And to see that warehouse, what spring trainings are typically, Brian, March, April.
That's right. Yep.
That looked a lot different come, peak season.
No doubt about it. And we understood that too.
Keeping those aisles clean and having some tight aisles there to get a forklift through. We always wanted to make sure that we weren't, digging our own grave there with, when things just came off of a truck and they're dirty and they need processed, you can't get a pallet jack or a forklift through. You can't even walk through. So we put a lot of time and energy into making sure that, everything was where it needed to be and it was accessible, but at the same time, it was helping us conserve that space, right? And I talked about the drive-in racks. We had probably about 10,000 folding chairs in our warehouse. You can only fold so many chairs and stack them so many high. So we went to, a local guy that had some used drive-in rack that we could get essentially 6 deep, 3 stories high. And that's how that cube housed just roughly about 10,000 chairs.
Unbelievable.
The rest were stored all in tractor trailers that we had sitting there. All of our poles were right at the dock doors so they can go in and out. So cattle eater racks, stakes and, tent jacks, all of that's right there. Those awkward pieces are right there to go in and out of trucks. Tent tops, we kept kind of central. Tables, chairs, we kept right in the middle as well. Again, it worked really well for us. And I've seen a lot of operations. I've seen ones that, I scratched my head and said, "I wish I would have known that." You hear the stories about, "Oh, well, this was a mistake and we somehow got here," but I do feel like a lot of the time it's years worth of development to get
Mm.
there and that ease just to make things better on everybody else. So it does take time.
That's one of the things we wanted to bring to everybody with the podcast too is especially for the younger operators that are in the midst of trying to figure this stuff out. Bring somebody like you that's already fought the fight, been through those battles, to hear from you about the things that worked and the things that didn't work. And I always challenge young people in the business to, humble yourself a little bit and listen to some of these veterans who have seen it from a lot of different ways and have figured out over time what works and what doesn't, and basically let them bear the cost of that, right?
Mhm.
And then take on what you're talking about as gospel, so to speak.
When you look at the old heads in the business, they're in the business and have been in the business for this long for a reason.
Sure.
They've done the legwork. So, like you said, I have to remind myself all the time, I don't know everything,
No.
and it's these older guys that have gone through the trenches and figured it out that you can really pull good knowledge from.
No doubt. And I always hear too, in our business, setting up an event's half the battle. You still got to get it back,
Mhm.
right? So back to warehousing, it's so incredibly imperative that you structure your warehouse so that when it comes off the trucks and it comes back in, it can easily find the place where it's supposed to land and not just stop at the dock door. How many times have you seen that, right? There's just a pile of crap at the back of the dock because the stuff came in a hurry and then it had to be offloaded. But those warehouse efficiencies sometimes can certainly help with all of that.
I totally agree, and the systematic approach with your crews, and to be working as a family, your warehouse staff as opposed to your field staff, and the butting of heads that happens there. Our huge thing, this big incentive that we put together was tagging the tops when they come down. You're going to get
Mhm.
a green tag or a red tag. Well, somebody's definition of A quality is different than the next guy down the road. That one leaf that stays in there with a little bit of water, and
Mm.
what happens? We would go through that constantly, and we would have a area of, sort of questionable things, but, sort of having to award, a good behavior of, tagging your tops and somebody checking over that and looking at those things to make everybody's job easier. It's not easy. I definitely recognize that. And, when it's pouring down rain and, when it's 10 o'clock at night, some of those systems would and do go out the door
Sure.
from time to time. But, getting to it first thing in the morning to have that conversation and here's what we saw and, shooting photos over to people to let them know what the concern is and this is needed for a turnaround the next day or 2 weeks from now. It's a process, and I do remember that very, very well.
Did you guys have quantifiable ways of making red versus green decisions?
Yeah, so, green was easy, right?
Yeah,
No,
sure.
absolutely no, moisture, drop cloth, everything, everything was done the right way where, you know, you get a tent top out there and you see, based on what you had to do of, hey, this one's starting to get a little gray and it's with a brand new one. The only way you knew that it was a little bit gray was when it was sitting next to that,
Mhm.
new one that, is 2 or 3 years old, right?
Yep.
The detail level rather than just putting a check mark on it. There needs to be a little bit of an explanation, right?
Yep.
That was, a few years back. I've been with TentOx for 4 years and, there were struggles, right? But the transition, I think that what I've heard from, whether it's RFID or, scanning things on your phone to give alerts to what that quality is within your system so that your salespeople can select that 10 top. From what I understand, that technology is going that way. And I would have loved to be a part of that at the time. Yeah, we just relied on literally
Mm.
Uline tags and a
Yep.
Sharpie in your back pocket.
Yep.
See, we use cattle tags. That's what we used on
Yep.
ours for
Okay.
cattle tags.
Yep.
Yep.
Yep. Yeah.
Awesome.
Same system though. I mean,
So
Yep.
let's move out of the warehouse and talk about field operations a little bit. Obviously, that's where TentOx makes its living, is primarily in the field. But what about site access. How revolutionary are these machines when it comes to, we kind of touched on a minute ago, but when we start talking about site access, give me a little bit of idea about the efficiencies realized with equipment.
So, to speak on, just site surveys in general, with a salesperson or a crew lead going out there to take a look at things before you quote the job to see what's involved. I'm in Pennsylvania where, we do have some mountains, some hills, some ups and downs, a lot of curbs to be jumped, a lot of parking the truck, a couple hundred yards away from where it needs to go, get through gates, get through some tight areas and weave through landscaping and hardscaping, right? That is where this machine is such, a time and labor saver. The big turf tires that come on that machine, that is a huge reason why Scott got behind it, not to be leaving that footprint behind. To look at those turf tip tires that you can, categorize the same as almost a lawnmower tire. The TentOx can be heavier than a lawnmower, right? But
Mhm.
the wider the better, right? Especially when turning. Things do change when you're on wet grass or soft ground. But to have a load on the front of that machine, 2,000 pounds and run back and forth 20, 30 times. And yeah, you can see, where those tires went, but to see some of that grass come up after the tire's done rolling across it and, give that customer peace of mind, again, it's that's huge. So a lot goes into that site survey. A lot goes into, making sure whether you have a TentOx or you don't, what's involved in this labor, right? What's involved in, yeah, it's one thing how we price the tent or how we price the tables and chairs, but again, that labor of running, two 60-inch rounds, rolling them, 100 yards away up a hill
Mhm.
or down a hill, it goes a long way. So I can't speak enough on, what that did for us by having a machine with that site survey as well to just get the information. Hey, the machine's going to do X, Y, and Z while you guys do this. So again, that and it goes back to the palletization of things and the bins and making sure that you can get it from here to there, minimal lifting and carrying, right?
Yep. And one of the things I want to make sure we don't overlook that Andy said, I want to make sure everybody heard, is that site surveys need to be done before you price the job.
Absolutely. That is a
Yeah. Yes,
must.
please. Yeah.
Yep. That's happened too many times where somebody goes ahead and prices the job, and then
And they're like,
all of a
"Oh,
sudden, oh, you mean I got to carry this thing 300 yards times 10 people,
up a
right?
mountain." Yeah.
So,
Yeah, especially on annual business, right? You always want to get better the next time you do that job. And no matter how you got the job the first time, whether it was a site survey or not, if it's annual business, you want to find a way to get better at it.
yep.
And, we had a lot of annual business. I'm sure a lot of other people do. And, that was the goal, right? To see if we can, well, whether it's drive stakes a day before, all the stakes are in the ground, drop ballast the day before, whatever it may be. So
Yep.
goes a long way.
Tell me about some other places that we can realize efficiencies and types in terms of, not to put you on the spot, but what other types of equipment are most often overlooked to gain these efficiencies? What are some things maybe that are out there? And this is not necessarily meant to be a commercial for anybody, but feel free to talk about anybody you want. Well, what kind of equipment's out there for maybe some of the younger, newer listeners that may not know about these things?
So, again, the TentOx system, a lot of people look at it as, a big purchase, and no doubt about it. There's a big price tag to that. Everybody speaks on what it can do and, what it brings to the table. But, as simple as, looking at these stake drivers that are battery powered and, they're efficient as well. And looking at the weight comparisons and even automated, stake pullers, anything to help be more efficient without, that big purchase of the TentOx, right? But, the biggest thing that sticks out in my head that I feel like a sort of a broken record is just your basic racking, right?
Hmm.
If you can put whether it's just, we were doing 30 tables in a rack with the machine, but if you can put 10 tables in a rack and you have the ability to wheel it into somewhere or wheel it on blacktop and push that rather than one at a time back and forth to the truck, racking to protect the items as well
Mhm.
from a standpoint of, getting your investment out of those items. Taking a look at some of that racking, and it could be as simple as, 4 uprights to put 8 foot, 6 foot, rolling tables in, or something elaborate, that has your chandeliers in. It's got your lighting, anything from, bar tops and things like that. That stuff, I see so many companies making their own racking at this point, and I
Oh
think
yeah.
it's awesome,
Oh yeah.
But, there's companies that do it. We used to use, believe it or not, those sound carts. They're padded on the inside,
Yep.
Yep.
but yeah, we would throw all our ratchets in there. They had huge casters on them, and you go in the truck, throw a ratchet around them, put the lift gate down, and just roll them out on blacktop to wherever the tent was going to be. Again, just the ease of moving everything around. If you don't have the equipment, looking at some of that, collapsible, palletization type stuff with casters, things to throw your extension cords in and all that other stuff, even if it's small. You don't want
Yep.
something that's too heavy, but it does go a long way. It does, go back to the bottom line
Yep.
after a whole season.
I've seen a lot of the modularity, if you will, in the way that these things go onto the truck. They're also a lot easier to secure within the truck, right? So you don't have things just flying around all over the place going down the road.
Absolutely. Square boxes fit in square boxes.
Yeah.
I mean, that kind of goes back to what we saw at Dan's place in Party Reflections. Literally, everything they had was in some type of box that had wheels on the bottom.
Everything's on wheels too.
Everything
and it goes back
was
to
on
the
wheels.
idea of moving things, and not just moving things on and off of a truck, but moving them within the facility.
Yeah.
Because it helps for staying organized for sure.
Oh, absolutely. I can remember, I mean, when we would do Walford's graduation or something, and we'd have hundreds of round tables, and you're just rolling two at a time, 400 yards.
Oh yeah.
It just takes forever.
Yeah. Not to mention that stuff on the tables, huh?
Oh, and I was about to mention that earlier, like around the round tables, it's got the metal.
Yeah.
As you roll that on concrete, asphalt, whatever it is, it ends up shaving off sides and having little burrs on there, and they would absolutely tear your hands up.
Yep.
Yep. With or without gloves.
Absolutely.
Yep. Andy, you mentioned it earlier, safety. Let's talk about it a little bit. Why safety doesn't negatively affect the bottom line. It's actually to the contrary.
So, I feel like doing an overview of just safety in general and where the industry is moving, whether it's, going down to, Party Reflections a few weeks ago, a month ago, to take a look at what's being debuted there. But, I do feel like safety's been at the forefront of this industry for the past 10 years. You're hearing about it constantly across the board at the different organizations, right? And, I do travel a lot. Our salespeople travel a lot. And we do see operations that are, in the full gear, the hard hats, the steel toes, the PPE. You see the opposite side of that. And I do feel like, that standardization, it's coming and it's growing and it needs to be here. The credit needs to be, where deserved with our industry. And, what we're doing is a career path. It isn't just a summer job anymore. There's some heavy stuff going up, with these rafters and A-frame and things and, the safety concern there. It's one day at a time and the movement is awesome. But in regards to TentOx, there's a lot of areas to improve on the safety side of things based on what we see and, what we go through. And we're harping on it constantly. But where that machine excels with the safety side of things, of swinging that sledgehammer, and you could swing a sledgehammer a million times, and at some point, that sledgehammer is still going to hit your foot eventually, if you, whether you have steel toe on or not. Because I've done it plenty of times. Whether you go overhand or whatever it is, and it's a 16 pound or a 10 pound, whatever it is. Things happen. Freak things happen. And, we try and, address these things. We had a safety committee at Event Central that we essentially had what we called, quote unquote, near misses. It didn't actually happen, but it very easily could have. How are we going to address this for the future?
Yep.
And it could be something as simple as a burr, on a cable, a cross cable, that wasn't to the top and didn't have, electrical tape around the end of it. It could be something as serious as not wearing your seatbelt and moving, the TentOx around the yard.
No.
Um,
We talk about a safety culture. I want to bring up the point too. That's what we're
sure.
talking about. That's a culture of safety. When you get
Yep.
ownership within your own people to rat themselves out, if you will, right? Because it's for the overall improvement of the company.
Yeah.
And I want those companies who are maybe younger in the business to hear things like this. That's how you create a safety culture.
Well, that's how you change things too for
Yeah.
the better.
Yep.
For sure. I think I've heard Kyle say it multiple times, shout out to Kyle at LNA, in which he said, some people don't recognize the need for safety until something bad happens.
Mhm.
And I think every company has been there, whether, it's minor or serious, right? And I've definitely been there. I know Scott has been there. I've been there on the TentOx side of things, just from manufacturing our tools, right? And that moment that, you have that gut feeling of, should I put that ear protection in, or my safety goggles on, and you choose not to do it. That's your gut telling you something, right?
Yep.
And, we want to do everything we can, even outside of, the Avant side of things, with knowing what our industry goes through and what they do and how they use this machine, and the decision of when to go down that incline with that full weight or go up decline, whatever it is, that decision making process, and just taking that few extra minutes to have that concern. But to get back to the question, sort of, where does safety play into this? I talked a lot about, the machine and those decisions from an operator standpoint, but I really just go back to, if the machine is doing what then can protect your employees, that's the selling point right there,
Mhm.
right? The liability that's there with, your guy falling down the hill with a two-wheel dolly fully loaded, and things like that, where, kinetic energy and, just that gravitational pull with the amount of weight that you have on that two-wheel dolly that's fully overloaded, and you think that you're strong enough to handle that. That's where the machine comes in, right?
Yep.
That's where there's a break, and that's where, you're able to understand how the machine reacts to those things as well.
Yeah.
Truly using it to your favor in all aspects, uh, especially
Yeah.
safety.
Yes,
Yep.
for sure.
So we've said a little bit about TentOx. Give us.
I was about to say, give us your little 2-minute spill on why TentOx.
Yep. Yep. So TentOx. Before you start, Andy, real quick too. So we've obviously talked about TentOx being instrumental in these things that we're talking about, but give us a little bit of just a rundown for people who haven't yet heard, maybe, about what TentOx is, what the machine is, what the available attachments are, and how they fit into the tent industry.
Yeah.
So, TentOx is essentially a subcompact loader, right? And that can be looked at as a all-terrain forklift with a boom, to extend and, get in the back of trucks and lift all these items that we're talking about. But TentOx sells an array of 6 different machines. Each one of those machines has a different price point. Each one can lift different weight capacities. Where the machine excels is, the thought process with making sure that this works for our industry is that machine, the ratio between what it weighs and what it can pick up is very similar. That's what puts it beyond a lot of different machines when this was vetted for our industry. So the concern of, towing comparable, a skid steer that's on tracks. And again, it's called skid steer for a reason. If it's, skid steers are great and they can lift a lot, but they're also heavy.
Mhm.
Staying between those DOT regulations of 10,000 pounds for towing capacity with a F-250, whatever it may be, that's important too, the ease of towing it and getting it to places, but then also obviously the footprint. We then pair that with, at this point, I think we're up to about 15 different attachments, but the most common attachments in the suite of tools are stake driver, a stake puller. We then have a universal plate that has a pocket on the front of it that will lift center poles.
Mm.
We then have a hook and a hitch if you got to move trailers around your yard, you're in the restroom business, or you have a hook on the front because you have Lego blocks that has rebar on the top. We also have block and roll forks that are just short forks that go on that plate so that they don't stick out the back of that ballast so that if you need to put your ballast up against a truck or up against somebody's house or, concrete building, you don't have to worry about, yeah, piercing through there.
Yeah.
Yes. And then another big attachment that's worked out really well for, structure-based companies is a roof panel puller. It's essentially a winch that works with wheel rollers on the rafters of the top of the tent. You then have your tension bar that feeds through the valence of that vinyl, and you can pull up to we've done 40 meters before with that to essentially allow that winch to work with the machine to pull that rather than having, 6 guys on one side.
That's
Still
all
having 2
hydraulic?
guys. It is. Yeah, it runs all off the hydraulics of the machine, and you have the ability to go forward and reverse and, throttle up obviously if you need to when you get to the peak. And we make wheel roller kits for each and every manufacturer that, companies carry.
Nice.
I'd like to see that
Handful of
one.
other
I
Yeah.
haven't seen that one
Okay.
before.
Handful of other we also produce a tool rack to house all these. Thought process with that is to keep it on the trailer and drive up to the left and right side of the trailer so that you can pick up one tool, put that back, and then go over to the other side of the trailer and pick up that one. At Event Central, we would leave that tool rack on the back of that trailer pretty much all season long. Yeah. And then we have a horn. We call it the horn. It's essentially a carpet roll, for guys that are doing a lot of this vinyl plank, 12-foot rolls that are extremely heavy. You got the insert there and you're just picking each roll up at a time and then leaving it elevated so that you can pull that carpet off in sort of one continuous motion. But that's a majority of what we're offering. And then we do have a handheld stake puller as well that we've named the Ox Tractor, and that's just a Honda engine with a hydraulic reservoir that has a cylinder on the front of it that can separate from the reservoir in the engine there, so that if you are on uneven surfaces, you can take that cylinder, pull out your stakes. It's got a 48-inch grab, so typically you only need one motion to get it up, and it's a 9K cylinder, so it's pulling those stakes out pretty quick.
Nice. Well, good deal. We're rolling up on an hour here. Andy, I can't thank you enough for being with us. Davis, do you have anything specific for Andy or any other questions? Or Andy, you got anything for us?
I'm good on my end, man. I really appreciate you coming on. Like I said, it's a tool that I think is unmatched right now in terms of its capabilities and what you can actually do with it.
Yep.
So
I agree. And I can't thank you enough for kind of bringing to the forefront of what I think a lot of people need to hear is about these operational efficiencies and how they can find ways to improve their profitability in their business, which ultimately comes back to how efficient they are in moving things around, both in the warehouse and in the field, on and off of trucks, etc. So again, Andy, with that, I thank you so much for being with us, and we will catch you soon.
Thanks, guys. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
real quick, while we're still in the podcast, guys, we just want to take this time to introduce somebody new to the sales team here at Top Tech. Gonna let him jump on real quick. Brian, you got anything to say about it?
No, Mr. Ray Garvey. Ray has been working on, with Top Tech's sister company, Michael Poo Covers, but Ray also is in and amongst our tent customers all over. So, Ray, with that, welcome.
Yeah, man, why don't you tell everybody a little bit about yourself?
I'm a aggressive sales guy. I'm a Scorpio. I enjoy the outdoors, which is why I work in tents. No, I come from
He's very shy. Yeah.
Incredibly shy. I'm not a man of many words. And for anyone out there who's met young Davis, they had to hire someone to let him carry the mantle of most handsome technical solutions specialist out there in the ether. So, no, for the better part of a decade and a half, I've worked in construction sales, design, and all adjacent industries. So roofing is not new to me. Exterior construction is not new to me. Efficiencies, moving in multiple dealer relationships. It was a pretty easy plug and play. And, really just, it's funny, the moment I get to know Brian Bolt, you're kind of like the Abe Lincoln of our industry there, Brian.
Just like him.
I'd recommend wearing a hat, if I were you, but that's neither here nor there.
That's right.
I mean, how cool is it? We get to work in an industry where every single thing we do, with the exception of disaster relief, we work in a leisure industry.
That's right.
Mm-hmm. People are they're having baptisms, christening, religious festivals, hiring events, like every single thing. The nebulous of what this industry is, these are reasons for people normally to celebrate. It's
positive. People are really, in this industry, people are generally happy. Then they throw a date on.
I loved what you mentioned earlier, that we're more of a, what was it, a moving and labor industry?
Yeah, that's what Dan Hook said. We're a labor and moving is kind of how he put it, right? We're using people to move things around, and it just happens to be the equipment that creates those events and, our vision. But at the end of the day, you better figure out how to move things around.
Yeah, the one thing in the last couple of months since I've gotten to work alongside you, not so much young Davis, but we'll get him there one day, is the ability, attitude reflects leadership, and, culture reflects leadership. And it's been really fun when the world is on fire and in chaos. Brian, for the most part, his hand stays calm. So if I take anything from him as he goes on to greener pastures with that 3-letter association, which will remain unnamed today, and just a couple
You're
of
talking
short...
about ARA?
I am talking about the American Rental Association. Yes, sir. But no, that's, you've been in this industry for the better part of 2 decades and you still enjoy it. You bring a smile into work every day. And, I don't think it takes a lot to lift up the spirits of those around you.
Mm-mm.
At the end of the day, we work in, we're technical solutions experts, but, we have to do sales, and people are they're going to put their time, their resource, and their money somewhere. And in my experience, people are typically more likely to do so when they're happy about the person who's getting their business. So
And
if
when they trust you.
Sure. Yep.
If anyone's going to ask, what do I take away from Brian Bolt in the couple of months I got to be around you, is, just, keep your servant's towel handy.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
I did not pay him to say that, by the way. So,
No. Hey, he just slipped a 20 over the table. Don't let him fool you.
It's getting so heavy in this room. We're going to need a TentOx to.
Right. Yeah. I will say this, and Davis, you jump in too, but as Pitching Tents moves forward without me here routinely, Ray's going to be a fixture as well with Davis, I believe. I think this podcast is in fantastic hands. Our original goal when we decided, Davis, and I talked about doing this, is we wanted to bring education to the forefront and educate these people. And I think you saw some of that with certainly today, with the idea of increasing your operational efficiencies. Easy for me to say. Those are the kind of things we want to bring to the listener, not just nuts and bolts of how to put a tent together, but how to create those efficiencies which are there to help your bottom line.
And for all those out there in Florida, Ray's going to be heading down to Florida here soon, right?
Yep. I don't know that we've actually put a date on that, but coming up, Ray will be down in Florida and some other places.
We'll be blasting an email blast out about be looking for Ray in your area.
Yep.
But
Q3 of this year and then Q1 next year, I've got 2 trips on the books to, that peninsula, the People's Republic down there in the southeast. Florida's an amazing state. You can play at a private country club and you can see some of the most ridiculous things in the world you've ever seen. So,
comes from experience, doesn't it? Right?
Florida's kind of like if Craigslist was a state. So I'm a big fan of the state of Florida. I personally requested to have that be mine.
I like that. Yep. So again, we're coming up on an hour. Davis, when you want to close us out?
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. Thanks for listening, guys, and we'll catch you on the next one, right?
And
Sounds
for
good.
the last time, Top Tech's Pitch Intense podcast, we wish a congratulations to Davis West if he steps into a new role.
That's right.
And we bid a fond farewell to the late and great Brian Bolt, because
that's right.
He's dead to us. We love y'all. Be good. Bye.
Later, taters.